And discussion with Mr. Boyd.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Hope everybody's having a good morning, and appreciate everybody's time today. So it's that fun time of year, we're going to talk about compensation. So in front of you, before we get started, there's one item I want to bring to the board's attention. This is something that just recently developed. And we don't know a lot about it yet, but long story short is the Department of Labor just recently passed a new rule that goes into effect July 1st of this year. Essentially, what they've done is they've changed the salary threshold. What that means is currently under wage and hour laws, under the Fair Labor Standard Act, salary threshold means that any position that you want to put as salary exempt has to be $35,000 or more. They've actually changed that rule to where it's going to go to $58,000 effective January 1st. They're going to tier it in. I think $43,000 will be the requirement July 1st of this year, and then January 1st it goes to $58,000. I don't know how that's going to impact the city's compensation, but Earl and I spoke about it. We're going to do our research, but I just want to make you aware that that law's changed. That's a pretty significant change. That's a 65% jump in the salary threshold, and they just passed actually on Tuesday this week. So just want to make you aware of that. In front of you, there's just a memo if you have any questions. Again, we don't know all the details yet, but we will be doing our research to see how that would impact city classifications. Okay.
So everybody else will be hourly considered? If you're below that, you're hourly?
Yes, it's the way the rules work now is if you can put an individual on salary, but if they're below that threshold, you still have to pay them time and a half or anything over 40 hours. What's interesting about this, it's not just, it's a nationwide rule, so it impacts all industries in all sectors. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out, because that's a pretty significant jump. I mean, so we don't know how that's going to impact the economy. Employers are going to be scrambling to revise their compensation strategy. We're in the same boat. We've been watching this for a while, and it kind of alludes to what I was mentioning when we were talking about trying to get the duties test done this year, which we still need to kind of get that done with Sergil Turner, because we thought this would pass. I honestly didn't think it would be at this level, because the last time they raised it was by $8,000. Now it's a $23,000 increase, so pretty impactful. So.
Yeah, remember in like 2019, we moved a bunch of people to salary, several positions to salary. And so that's 100% going to affect some of those.
Yeah.
But what is interesting, we saw last week about the occupational taxes in education. A lot of teachers are salaried by contract. This is going to force the schools to reconsider that, or to at least adapt that compensation to this requirement. And you can go through across the board where that's true in industry. So it has the potential to impact all of our revenues, all in a good way or balanced way, or who knows? Like it all depends on how those industries react.
Yeah, because employers can take any kind of strategy. Like, for example, if someone's close to that threshold, they may just bump their salary up above it, or if they're off by 10 or 15,000, they could obviously have to pay them overtime, or they cap their hours, at 40 hours a week, and they have to track it. And to Earl's point, the education sector is going to be really interesting, because so we just don't know how it's going to play out, not just for the city, but for the economy as a whole. So pretty comprehensive. It's probably one of the biggest federal labor law updates we've seen, significant probably in the last 10 years. Okay. All right. So we'll go ahead. In front of you, I've drafted a memo here for you. I don't just kind of an overview, but we're going to talk about this in the PowerPoint. But in the memo here, I've got just a summary of the compensation strategy, and we'll kind of dive into that. Our goal today is just to bring you the strategy options and our staff's recommendation allow you to review that and give feedback and what thoughts and direction for staff to go for the new budget year. So with that said, this was our strategy for this year, and we've talked about that. Really hasn't changed our strategy over the last probably 3 to 4 years. Our goal was to do an updated market study, which we did that in January this year, our market review with Hannah Group. We had them go in and look at our classifications. We've actually had them do that annually for the last 3 years in a row, just because of the dynamic labor market that we've all know is happening. And then our other part of our goal is to make sure not only what we do is keeping us market competitive, but it's also sustainable. We want to make sure that our payroll liability is sustainable a long time, with factors like inflation. We've got a lot of variable labor costs, healthcare, our retirement rates through CRS, those are different every year, so we don't know what those are going to be until we get into those renewal processes. And then, of course, going beyond that, our strategy is right now, until this labor market stabilizes, which I don't know if it will or not, is to continue to look at this every year. It has to be an annual review process. That way we can make incremental increases to try to stay competitive, but also make sure our liabilities are sustainable. Just quick overview, these are, and we talked about this last time, that's just a snapshot of employment statistics. So these are all of our authorized jobs. We have 175 full-time positions. This is just a breakdown of where those positions are throughout the city. Now, these are some of our statistics, and these are things that do impact our budget. Good news is this year we're seeing another reduction in our CRS rates. Non-haz is going down 3.6%. Hazardous is going down 5%. I think it was in 21, 22, I think we saw a 5% increase year over year on hazardous duty. Of course, that could always change, but so we really try to kind of set those to that bucket of labor costs to the side, because we know that could always go back up in the future. And then these are your COLA rates. And this is really important because COLA is kind of driving part of our strategy. You can see the rates for the last 4 fiscal years. For 25, it is 3.4%, which is, of course, that's 3.4% on top of the inflation that we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years. So we're really running somewhere around 20% inflation when you look at that. And then, of course, down here is all the things that goes into your personnel costs, base salaries, part-time salaries, overtime. We have incentive pays. Those are a big part of our labor costs too, because we have longevity pay, but we also have like training incentives like police, fire, they have training incentives. So we have to factor all those things into the equation when we're looking at our recommendation for the new plan year. So real quick, this is our just quick summary of the compensation study results. Hannah Resource Group, same strategy we've had the last 3 years. They use multiple sources. They look at population range of 20 to 99,000 for the greater Lexington area, all of our job classes. In simple terms, when they provide us with a proposal this year, the average variance, market variance, was 6.8% on all jobs. To go to the full market, we estimated, and again, this is just an estimate, it would be $1.5 million in base salaries across the board estimated. So as we look at this, and Earl and I have sat down, we've talked quite a bit, and we've also consulted with Lee from a financial standpoint. These are 3 strategy options that we feel like the city would have for compensation for the coming year. Option 1 is simply you would leave your salary ranges the way they are now, but raise each person to the next step on their experience scale. We've talked a lot about experience scale because that helps maintain equity within the city. Like, for example, if you have a 10-year police officer working for you and you hire a new officer, you don't want that new officer with 10 years experience coming in, making more or less. You want them to be equitable. Under that strategy, the cost impact to the city would be $170,000, which is about 1% budget increase. The average employee increase under that step is 1.24%. And under this strategy, this is simply, like I said, keeping your pay grades the same, and you're just moving each individual to the next level of their experience. Now, option 2, this would be implementing a COLA plus the experience step. In simple terms, what you would do is you would raise your grades by 3.4%, the grade range to apply to the COLA, and then you would plug the individuals in on that grade and then on their new experience scale. Under that model, the average, the estimated cost would be $585,000 to the city, which is about a 3% budget increase. And when I talk about budget, that's personnel budget increase. I should have clarified that earlier. Average increase in employees under this model would be 4.4%, but under this model, at minimum, no one would receive less than the COLA of 3.4% because you're raising those grades. In your memo there, I actually put an example of how that would impact someone if you did that, if you went with option 2, just to show you how that would be impactful to employees. And then option 3, of course, would be to do the full market adjustment based on the HANA study. One of the things there we would have to dig into is look at how that would impact each classification, because each classification is off market, by different amounts, and that's always the data that we find every year when we do the study. But again, that's an 8% budget increase.
Yeah, that is one of the things that's confusing and that employees, it's very difficult to communicate. Not all positions are under market by the same amount. So we can have a Class 3 operator that is under the market by a different amount than a certified police officer. And so when these individuals are talking together, one of them may have had an adjustment last year, for example, of one number, and another one have a totally different adjustment that could have been a lot more. It's not designed to create when you're looking at the market, I want to just take a moment to reiterate that. It's not designed to be, when we're talking about adjusting to the market, it's not a flat increase for everybody. It's not a city, the city doesn't have one position. We have a multitude of different positions with different skill sets required. And so then what the hamstring is we struggle to communicate all those levels of detail. We try to provide enough information to kind of understand what's happening. But what Randy does is always equate that into an average employee. So he pulls all that and distills all that down into just an average number for you. So when we're talking about the average rate increase, and that, go back to that previous slide, Randy, that option, for example, option 1, that average employee increase, it's not everybody has the same step in their experience-based pay. So it might be $900 for one person and $500 for another person, just because their individual steps in their graded position are different. And I want to reiterate that. I don't want it to be, it is not discriminate. It is purely a mechanical thing. And so I want to be as transparent as possible with that so that you all have a full understanding that there's not something that we're doing on the backside that is different than those statements being made. It's just the struggle. Nobody matches that 1.24% exactly because it's an average. In other words, you can't go any individual, nobody will step up and distill their change down to say, oh, that was exactly 1.24%. You won't find that in the system. And honestly, the 4.4% will be the same way. You won't find that precise. You may find a couple, but most of them will be different than that 4.4%. Most of them will be a larger increase than the 4.4%. There will be some that will be between 3.4 and 4.4, but for that average to exist. But the floor is 3.4% under that second scenario. I hope that makes sense. And I just want to, as much time as you all want to talk about that, we will do. I don't want to just burden you with that conversation unless you all just want to have it. I understand that's confusing. If you all want to come by my office sometime and we'll sit down and go through the entire thing again, we'll do that. I just don't want to assume that you all understand that fully because it is complex, and I don't want to assume that all the employees, when they're talking to each other over the coffee machine, it is difficult to get them to assume that everybody gets the same number. They don't. It's not a uniform distribution. It's not a 4.4% raise or a 1.24% raise across the board. That is not what's happening. Does that make sense?
I appreciate you saying that, because last year, I mean, me,
Right.
and I'm just gonna say me, I mean, I understood it as a six, everybody was getting that and minimum, and then it was not happening. So,
Well, everybody did get the 6.4%.
well, I mean, but there's a lot higher, and I
There's-
understand the
yes.
scales and stuff, but like for me, I would like to see the scales
Okay.
and Hannah's thing, I think you gave it to us. I don't know if you'll do that later, like our compensation plan.
Yeah.
And then where you think people are gonna go because they didn't match last year.
So that's
In April and June didn't match, let's put it that way.
well,
Like those scales, so,
yeah, I understand why you said that.
Yeah.
And so what we'll do is, so the first step is a philosophical direction. Once you all tell us this, we will, and there'll be several sheets to it, but we'll take a moment to make sure we print all that detail for you.
Yeah.
I don't think that Randy's printed all that before. We will do that this time.
Yeah, we can.
And it will be a lot of paper, but we'll give that to you, just so you 100% know, and if somebody, you can dive into it if you want to take the
Yeah.
time and find out what an individual position would be adjusted.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to get all the way through that. I don't think we printed all that detail for you. I think that led to some of the confusion.
Yeah.
right. And I think, I mean, for me personally, like, when you get to that point, if we knew, okay, not individuals, but how many are above this and how many are below this, and also the Hannah, nothing against Hannah, it's just, I think last year we got in the same boat. I don't wanna be where we were last year. You're looking at it in January, and then April, other cities are
Yeah.
right behind you, and then we're 4 steps behind in July when we do our raises, So I think we've got to look, I don't know how you're going to do that, if you can
Yeah.
look at it in March, or if you can just go circle around to see what other cities are doing before we do this in June, and then in July, we have 7 people leave.
We can,
I will say this, to defend Randy's process that he went through. I think last year was weird. I do think that, because I do think there was a lot of agencies, particularly on the police and fire side, that just threw random numbers at it.
Yeah.
And so that meant that some of Hannah's initial work wasn't, it got superseded by that, the reality is just what people were doing. I do think there was folks that just said, well, we're gonna spend, instead of a market adjustment, we're just gonna throw $5,000 at the position, or $2 an hour. I think you saw a lot of that, and that was not predictable by Hannah and Randy's process. So I hear you. I don't know how, I'm with you on that.
Yeah,
I
I'm
don't know
not
how you
saying it
overcome
was
it.
whatever, I'm not
Yeah.
saying, okay,
Yeah.
Randy did about, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying I would like, me personally would like it to be more current, or we're just watching what's happening, so that we're not caught with that in
Yeah.
December, because we don't want to lose people.
Correct.
And we need to
Yeah.
be ahead of them.
well, Don, your point is very valid, and I'll tell you, it's a struggle because the one things that we've seen a lot, and not every agency does this, I can't speak for every employer, but a lot of times what we find is they react on the fly. Well, maybe we're gonna throw out $5,000 here for the police officers, but sometimes what agencies fail to do is they don't look at their whole structure and don't take care of their internal staff too. And so
Right.
it's a kind of I don't wanna say a knee-jerk reaction, but but to your point, it creates challenges for us to stay on top of it, because honestly, we could be sitting here talking about this today, and in June, we may have some major market shift. It's not cooling down any. It's definitely not stabilizing, so.
Especially with the new rule.
Yeah, well, that's gonna play a big role into it. And, that was one of the reasons we signed that 2-year contract with Hannah, to say, look, we're locked into a 2-year fixed fee, because now we can come back to you at any point and say, review this data. So maybe what we can do is look at our proposal when we have data, and we could have them review again, maybe May or June, and say, hey, how much is this off the market? We could definitely do that, take that extra
I
step.
mean, maybe, just so that
Maybe,
we're
yeah.
closer
It's
to
a-
other cities when they
it's a-
start, if they're doing market.
I always say we're always chasing the hamster wheel, since.
Right.
I mean, that's
Never
what.
gonna change.
It's never gonna change, but your point is valid. But one thing we've tried to do is make sure that, it's a domino effect. When you make one change, you gotta, and we want to make sure that it's structured across the board, especially
Well-
when you hire laterals in and things like that. You don't want them to come in making more than, say, an existing employee, and so we want to make sure that doesn't happen either.
Well, all that dialogue is really what steered us in our conversation as we're looking at what do we recommend as staff to the commission? What's our recommendation
Yes.
this year? We've got to recommend something that's sustainable.
Yeah.
And so Lee will get into the numbers of that. But what we wanted to philosophically recommend, that it was guided with that conversation in the back of
Yeah.
our heads. We didn't want to do the floor because we just, that took a step back, flat out. With inflation, with where it's at, that just ultimately decreased the effective dollar for the employees.
Well,
So that was the beginning point for us.
And, you know, and we always want to be cognizant of the healthcare costs, because that's a big component, and we want to make sure we keep that healthcare rich, and that's, you know, and we've talked about it recently, that's been a struggle, that's a rising cost, not just our claims, but just the industry as a whole. Medical costs are on the rise, so we kept all that into, what can we do to keep that stabilized, but also sustain additional payroll liability long-term. But maybe this next slide will help answer some of your questions. These are great questions, and I think we can do a better job of bringing some more data to the table this year to show how that really works, because it is complicated. The one thing I will say is we want to make sure when we build out compensation that it's formulary and it's systematic, that it takes any subjectivity out of the equation when we calculate salaries. But if, and I know I'm kind of skipping ahead, but while we're on this subject, if you look at the bottom part of the slide, these are the factors, to your question, would impact compensation. You know, it's the pay grade range after COLA adjustment, you know, whether it's a non-hazard or hazardous scale, because non-hazardous is on a 27-year experience step. We have hazardous on a 20-year scale. So that, you know, if you, like, for example, on the hazardous scale, the year-over-year steps are bigger increases than, say, a non-hazardous, because you've got a smaller scale, and that's and we did that originally based around well, I know it changed now, but the Tier 1 retirement timeframe. And then also, how big is your spread of your job classification? Like, you may have, say, a lower graded position, that spread may be 40%, where a larger classification may have a 50% spread. So those factors come into it. And then also, what is that individual's experience too? So those are all the things, hopefully that helps answer some of your questions. Those are all the things that impacts the individual's increase. But we want to make sure that it's systematic and that we have our job is to make sure those scales are built out correctly and the step process is applied correctly. But, you know, but as far as looking at the recommendation, we're recommending the second option, which would be the COLA plus experience step. We feel like that's the most sustainable long-term out of the three options right now. And so, in simple terms, under this, no one would get less than, to Earl's point, no one would get less than 3.4%. The average, when you average it out, is about 4.4. Some may be above, some will be below that 4.4 average, because again, that's an average. But those calculations are based on those compensation factors there. And we built out a formulated process and we plug those numbers in, and the system tells us what those salary increases are. The other part of that it would help us, like, again, when we hire lateral employees, we're making sure that we're not, you know, having people come in making more than existing employees with the same level of experience, because that's really important to us too. Our differentiator for existing employees is our incentive pays, like our 3 and 5 year longevity, their training pins, things of that nature. That's how those are differentiate their compensation for their time with the city.
Let me say this too. So if you go back to the option 3, where you're going all the way to the market's unstable right now. This Department of Labor rule kind of indicates that also. Saying that, you could probably try to push yourself towards that heavier impact. But I think if you do this, you're at least maintaining with the market changes, predictably. But our priority too is to get labor. So yes, keeping people's critical, and given a valiant effort to doing that, but if you've got people and you've got a couple of vacant positions, like in the police, they're overworked, at some point, money doesn't matter, peace of mind matters.
Yeah.
Right? So I think what I'm trying to do is pick one of the options or pick a landing point where we have an increased opportunity to hire back the employees that
Yeah.
currently, so we have 2 police officers we need to get back, and we have 1 firefighter we need to get back. And so our priority would be, if funding's available, is to get the police officer first, then probably the firefighter second, and then the other police officer third. Frankly, as I walk through it, there's some other positions that the police have talked about, and dispatch, all those things. I think our biggest 3 priorities is try to get those 3, our biggest 3 expense priorities. You know, there's some reorganizational things that Randy's gonna have up here that are kind of neutral, no cost. But I think that's our biggest priority, is get the man-hours available back, drive down overtime. There's things that are impacted with those decisions.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to create a budget that adjusted pay, and if we get the opportunity, then we need to hire those 3 positions back, or in terms of our recommendation of priority, the police officer, then the firefighter, then the police officer.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
That's a good point, because that's another factor we look at when we build this out, because we say, okay, can we bring back those positions? Because at some point, it does become actually a higher cost, because then you get into overtime, because if you're short-staffed, and then it's that work-life balance too. We want people to take time off work. We need to make sure we have adequate staffings. We raised our vacation and time a couple of years ago, and, people struggle, some departments, they struggle to take time off, and we want to make sure that people, because you can only burn the candle at both ends so long, essentially, and so we want to make sure, so all those things are factored in when we present this. So these are some numbers. This is what your personnel budget trend looks like since fiscal year '22. Right now, if you did no changes with the personnel budget, you are looking at, there is about a $700,000 increase. The 2 factors that drive that are the increase in health insurance and also the mid-year adjustments that we did on police and fire last year. If you do with the the first option, which is the experience step, you're adding another $177,000 roughly to the budget. But if you do the staff recommendation, you're looking at approximately a little over $1 million to the budget combined. So it would basically go roughly from 19.15 for the current year to 27.04 is what but that's your total personnel budget. That includes all labor costs, health insurance, overtime, payroll taxes. That's the full labor cost for the city for each department under the recommended option. And then this is what your personnel budget variance looks like. You can see, fiscal year 22, 23, we did big increases, because obviously we did those was when we got into the first couple of years of the market study. Fiscal year 24, you can see if you did nothing again, that your budget is going to increase by about approximately $700,000. And then you can see the variances with the two options in front of you, what the budget impacts would be. And then this is just a trend history of the compensation adjustments we've done over the last few years. You can see, last year we took a bigger increase, which, it was $800,000. That, as we discussed before, at minimum, every employee got at least 6.5% or above, and that was a big increase last year, because we know that last year was probably our biggest impactful year with inflation and wage hikes. But if you look at this year's compared to fiscal year 22, it's kind of getting back into that stabilized range that we had about 4 years ago. And then, of course, this would be what your breakdown cost is by sector. So you can see, obviously, base salary makes up 54% of your personnel budget. 23% is variable cost. Just want to hit on that variable, because that's really that key factor that we obviously don't know what's going to be every year. That includes your health insurance, your retirement rates, and your part-time salaries. That's what that 23% portion of the pie chart makes up. And then the other items are, obviously the things outlined here. So always, the variable cost is the hardest, again, because we just don't know what that's going to be year over year. Obviously, we can control part-time cost to a certain level, but the health insurance is the one that we really don't know what those rates look like until January or February when we do our renewals. And then this is your personnel costs by sector. I always like looking at this one because it's interesting to see where the city's investing in its human capital. You can see right now we have roughly about 55% of your human capital investment goes into safety personnel, police, fire, dispatch. About 25% is in utilities, and the other makes up all the other non-hazardous jobs within the city. So city is, and obviously with the mid-year changes you did with safety personnel, we are investing heavily in public safety and water utilities too, which, again, I always like to look back at that survey Lee did. I thought that was really interesting because where the city's investing its capital kind of aligns with what the public's, biggest areas of needs are. And then, of course, this is just a bar chart of the breakdown of how much your labor costs would be by department under the recommended option 2 that we've presented. Now, as far as, so these are the things that we want to talk about with organizational changes that Earl alluded to. So utility administration, and we've kind of discussed this before. One of the things we would recommend is we have the utility clerk classification. That job, and Marshall and Earl and I have talked quite a bit about it, along with Erica too, is the duties, responsibilities of that position are pretty high, considering they're a frontline person. That's the first individual most people see when they come into the city, so they're representing the city. They have a lot of accountability with cash handling, account maintenance, and so we don't feel like that job compensation is where it needs to be. We have some other clerk positions throughout the city, like our HR clerk, engineering clerk. We think, to create equity, that we think that job should be classified more along the lines of those positions, especially with the duties and responsibilities and accountability that's on that position. And so that's one change that we would recommend when we bring our compensation plan to the board.
Understanding too, we've had a terrible time filling that position.
Yes.
We've had, 3 attempts this year?
Yeah, 4. Actually, we've had 4
4.
people turnover in that
Yeah.
position.
And so something's not structurally right with that. Otherwise, you would not be having those flips. So the first effort is to raise the standard a little bit, just to see if that's what it is.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we try to do exit surveys when folks leave, and we'll sit down, and each person I've talked to there is like, I didn't realize that this job encompassed so much multitasking. I'm dealing with customers, I'm making sure I'm handling cash, I'm doing all these things, and it's answering the phone, and so it's a lot, and so I don't feel like we don't feel like that compensation's there. To Earl's point, we've had a hard time recruiting and retaining employees, so we feel like this is the first step in kind of fixing some of those challenges. And then as far as, the other recommendations, 911, we talked about this, and Tony talked about it through the budget process, and he and Rebecca and I have talked behind the scenes, along with Earl, is we want to reclassify one telecommunication officer to a senior tele position. Would not be any added headcount. You currently have 14 individuals in authorized positions in 911. That would stay the same. Essentially, you would just reclassify. So what that does, it allows you to get more supervision. And tell me if I'm wrong, Chief, on each shift, it allows you to spread out your supervision responsibilities. Okay.
Now, I said that incorrectly earlier. I was thinking of the Parks and Rec changes being cost neutral, but those two do add cost, but not, it's only marginal.
Yeah.
It's not material necessarily.
Yeah. I would say by doing those changes, this is just off the cusp, probably somewhere around additional $20,000 on the labor budget to do those 2 classification changes. That's just an estimate. So it's not really, not a large increase, but it is very impactful operationally. And then, spoke with Earl and Josh and Tommy, Jenny Rogers' position. Right now, currently, we have 1 vacated position, which is assistant maintenance supervisor. athletics. What we would like to do is reclassify that job to the Jenny Rogers Community Center Coordinator. And talking to Josh and Tommy, as we look at it, that would be a lateral reclassification. The salary range would probably stay about the same, so there wouldn't be any increase to the budget. You're just simply taking that job, reallocating those funds to the new community center to hopefully have someone in place there, by maybe midsummer, once it opens in June. And then, of course, Earl already alluded to the 2 police and fire positions. Through the mid-year compensations, part of our agreed approach for police was we deferred 2 certified police officer positions to use that money towards the salary adjustments. We just want to, as Earl alluded to, have those conversations through the budget process, see if there's a possibility to bring back one, if not both of those. Same thing for the fire. We deferred 1 position there on the fire to use those funds to make the salary increases in January. And then, of course, as far as overall strategy, this is just kind of continue on our strategy. Every year, I think it's important, we continue to look at our organizational analysis, make sure organizational hierarchy makes sense, the jobs are classified where they need to be. And then, of course, we're going to always look at our pay classifications. Donna, to your point, we probably need to start, we've been trying to look at these more incrementally, and it's hard. I don't have a crystal ball saying we can keep pace, but we are trying to keep pace, and it's just, it's a lot of unknowns, but we'll continue to push forward and then just continue to benchmark against our rewards programs too. That's the other thing we hadn't talked about. It's not, we got to make sure that we stay competitive, not only with salaries, but our total rewards like vacation time, holiday pay. Kind of talked about that at our budget meeting last week, that, we're going to bring some things for discussion through the budget process on our total rewards policies for you all to give us feedback on. So that's pretty much everything we've got. In simple terms, we're recommending that option 2, and so we'll kind of open up if you guys want to ask us more questions and feedback.
I really like the organizational changes. I can tell that you really dug deep with the department heads and got really good recommendations. I'm really glad to see the utility clerk being moved up in responsibility. And also, that's like the front line, who the citizen sees first, and that affects citizens' views of the city. So that'll be great, having a friendly face there. JH had brought up doing a 5-year plan with all of the retirees coming up with police and fire. So I guess along that line, I see here, we want to rehire 2 vacated police, 1 vacated fire. Shouldn't we already be proactive to get 2 more in the pipeline with police or fire with all these retirements coming?
Yeah, and we do, whenever we know the retirement's coming, we try to actively go ahead and recruit. And that's a good question. And I think that's one thing we would like to talk about is when we talk about succession planning, we talked about we're trying to build that out. We're working on our leadership program, PCTC. But when we have known retirements, sometimes it's key to try to overhire in the short term. So we probably need to build in some, Lee's probably going to throw something at me, but,
The problem is in the short term, in the fiscal year you're in, you got to have a balanced budget.
Yeah.
And so we did some overhiring at the water plant a couple of years ago intentionally because it takes so long to get licensed.
Yes.
Very similar to the police. The situation with the utilities is as bad as the police,
Yes.
frankly, or worse. And so we would like to get to a point where this budget's filled out and we've gotten to a balance point on this budget, and then assess what to do, continue to assess what to do with the turnover that's expected. That's going to affect our budget through efficiency, but then also you're going to replace senior employees sometimes with younger employees. And so we want to make sure that we use that to our advantage to make sure we're overhiring to make, so that the 5-year approach is a very credible,
Yes.
and I appreciate you saying that.
So you guys will work on that?
Yes,
Yes,
we
we
do
will.
I
need
think
to.
we all are
yeah,
in
we do need
agreement
to
that's
do that.
very necessary. So police, fire, and utilities to do the 5-year.
Yeah. And we've already kind of started
Stay ahead
some
of the
I
curve.
don't know what the final plan would look like, but we've already kind of started talking about we've already taken steps towards that, like, for example, maybe you got a mid-level employee that we think's a high performer. We want to try to get them into that leadership academy so they can get some of those competencies, and do more job shadowing and mentoring, because like, a supervisor really needs to show their right hand what they do, right? Because that way they're prepared to kind of transition into that. But if you have to hire, say if you had to hire outside the organization, ideally, especially if it's a key job, like a managerial position, you really want to have somebody in there 2 to 3 months ahead of time to work with them, because they got to understand the culture of their employees, how to manage their employees, learn the things. So that's why we talk about, we really need to try to get to that point where we can have that ability to overhire in the short term, especially when we have those key jobs that are leaving, if they're outside the organization.
Let me say, add to, Randy's subject is very boring, in a sense, because if you get into it, I mean, look, there's numbers and trends.
Sorry, Randy.
We want
I
to
know,
Not
I'm not
you.
going to defend,
This your
listen, no, I
subject.
get it, I do.
we want to freely acknowledge that, and Randy does an exceptional job, but it's still boring to present sometimes.
Yes.
Because you're talking about, well, the rate of retirement is 3.4% versus 3.6%. It's very,
Well-
data-driven. And so we would want to make sure that we offer, any time you want to come in and spend a more time with us, I'll bring Randy in and we'll put stuff up on the screen for you.
Good.
If you just don't understand something or really just want to reiterate something to yourself and see it again, just make sure we'll do that and we'll do whatever
Yeah.
to try to increase your all's awareness of what's happening. It seems like a black box. We don't want it to be. We're
No.
not trying to make it that way. Right.
And I don't disagree. It can be very dry. And what I try to do here is kind of summarize it, but there's so many complex variables that go into this, especially when you talk about your workforce as a whole and all these different things, there's a lot that you have to think about. And so sometimes it's hard to articulate this in a simple, PowerPoint, but, because there's a lot that goes behind the scenes that we have to consider, like I always use that domino effect scenario, like if you change one thing, it's going to affect the whole organization. So we always try to make sure we're cognizant of all those different things before we bring something to the table.
And I think we started this conversation back when we were starting to raise salaries and get more competitive, is the sustainability part of it. Because like you said, it's still, salaries are still going up. So sustainable for us may not be competitive in the market. So I don't know what you do about that. Is that something you all?
We have to deal with expenses. Randy and I do, in the year we're going into. I think you've done about all you can do, honestly, with what our economy will support. We have to get into that. How do we deal with health insurance long-term? What strategies can we do to drive that number, to get $500,000 out of that number next year? So that you've got $500,000 for next year. That is our priority. And it's not just health insurance, it's across the board, we know that. We have been very liberal with making sure things we made an effort to get things caught up over the last few years, there's no question about that. If something needed painted, we painted it. And we made an effort to paint it. I'm not saying we're perfect, but by no means. But we didn't, with City Hall was being painted some last week, right? Or earlier in the week. We've not said no to those things. So we've painted City Hall. We're working on the police department on their side. If Tommy was painting the flagpoles last week at the park, we've tried to get caught up on maintenance. We understand fully that we moving forward, we've got to be a little bit more conservative now. It's time that we lock in our reserves down. We've spent that on where we said with the parks investment on streetscapes. We fully understand now we're at the point where now we've got to say, okay, how long can we hold off on painting that? We're we're not back to that, but we've got to be aware of our expenditures, and prioritize those expenditures so that they align with what the community's priorities are, which is why that survey helps us a little bit.
I just wanted to, I mean, I understand it's gotta be sustainable, but I also understand, our employees make the city run. That's just
Absolutely.
as simple as it is. And
Right.
what do they want? They want police, fire, water.
Yes.
Those are your main, and sewer, obviously, but, I mean, that's what they want, and parks, I guess. But in this, I'm just trying to review what we heard last time. So the promotion, or the senior telecommunicator, you've got that listed. The police had asked for a reassignment of a patrol sergeant. I don't see that in there.
We haven't discussed that. That's still part of the
Okay,
discussions coming
because I
forward.
mean, we're
Yes.
talking about human
Capital.
capital and how people get too tired. That would relieve some without a huge
think-
amount of expense.
What we try to do is use a three-tier approach on this every year. Is number one, focus first on the healthcare, right? Because that comes first as far as make sure that's stabilized. Now we've got that done. Step two is take care of your existing staff with compensation. And then step three, look at the additional staffing needs. So we're on step two right now. Step three will be forthcoming once we go through step two.
Well, I mean, that, to me, I just wanted to understand, because that looks
Yeah.
like what we would be recommending. So I wanted to make sure some of the things they ask for are in there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're not opposed to that. We
No,
just, I don't think Randy had brought it up to us yet. And I think me and Tony hadn't sat down and talked about
Okay.
organizational changes
Yeah,
yet.
exactly.
And go ahead, Tony.
Please.
I was gonna say that the sergeant is not gonna be necessarily an added position.
Right, it's a reassignment.
Just a
Reassignment,
Right.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's not-
Right.
Yeah.
But that's sort of like the senior telecommunicator. It's on there. I just want to make sure that, that's on there, but police ask for it and it's not on there. So I don't know. I just thought they
Correct.
were apple to apple,
Correct,
you
yeah.
know?
Right.
And then, you mentioned the frozen positions, unfreezing those, and I know you said it would come later for new positions or something. You'll recommend that.
Unfreezing the
if-
positions will be the next step.
Right.
Once we
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
back to balanced.
Okay, because I mean, again, I think code enforcement, I understand you've got Ian, or you've got one person, and that's a lot. I mean, because I personally would like to see more reports on the properties that are condemned in Danville, or the mowing, or what we're gonna do to change things that look bad in Danville, and that is codes, and that's not, like the police, it sort of got put in there, but I think you've gotta look at that. I don't know the answer. I'm just putting my comments out. as
Yeah,
far
and
as-
it seems like we have one person, and Junction City has one person.
Yeah.
And we're a
it's
lot
Danville,
bigger. And once again, that position is a frontline person that that's what the community views the city as, when you have those frontline people out there, trying to take care of complaints. And, I had one lady, we went up here 14 times to get, so it's not real efficient, and I'm glad we're trying to fix those things, but I don't know if we need an extra employee or what.
Well,
they-
It's just
They sort of asked for
important.
parking, maybe code enforcement, I don't know if it's a combination, that'll come later. But I just want to keep it on the forefront that, I mean, those are things that I understand you got to be sustainable, and then water and sewer, obviously, I don't know if you can overhire and fire. That's a thought, I know the money's tight, you've got to balance everything, but also you got to keep moving forward, so.
Well,
We've got that down, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll try to address those comments provided by both of you.
yeah. No, thank you for that. And it's like I said, we try to do it in that tier approach, take care of those first two steps. And then once we feel like we're comfortable, that third step is when we can really expand those staffing proposals based on your feedback, so. Because it's, our first goal is we don't want to overhire too and not be able to give salary increases to your existing staff. So there's a balance there, right? So, but I made notes of that, and we'll bring some of that back, yes, absolutely.
I guess when folks come, this is not your department, when folks come to ask for money, this just reinforces the importance of economic development. That's the only way we're going to
Yeah.
have more income, period. And we really got to support economic development.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think labor cost makes up approximately a third of the city's budget. That cost is not ever going, it's never going to go down because your recruit and retain plus cover your your expenses, liabilities, it's only gonna go up. So it's a challenge, but that's, well, like you said, Donna, people are what drive public service in the city, right? I mean, without the people, you can't perform the services, so human capital is a big, it's the most key component of this, in my opinion. Okay. So that's all the information as we have, so we can, kind of turn it over to Lee unless you have any other questions. And we'll be, like I said, if you want to sit down with us one-on-one at any point, we'll be more than happy to kind of do a deep dive in anything you have after this meeting, if you'd like.
You'll be bringing back more information, and then the personnel policies will come to us eventually,
Yeah.
to see the whole package. And-
Yes. Yeah, our goal is to bring all that kind of through the whole budget process, yeah. And then, and like I said, we're gonna continue to get our heads around this labor law change with the salary threshold. That's probably an interesting dynamic, so we'll see where it falls, because that may impact some of our job classifications. I don't know just yet. It's still too early to tell.
This is already in effect?
Yeah, it passed,
said-
it actually, we knew it was coming, because we've been
Okay.
watching, we didn't know what the final rule would be. It goes into effect July 1st. They're gonna do it in 2 tiers. The threshold goes to 43,000 and some change July 1st, and then January 1st, the threshold becomes effective at 58,000. So yes, it applies across, it's a federal law, so it applies across all states, so, unless a state law can supersede that, it can't diminish that, so that's coming from the Department of Labor, so it's
And
pretty-
Earl, to your point, I also appreciate the city taking care of what we've got, because you can take care of what you got just like your house. If you let the roof fall in and the water's coming in, then guess what? You're gonna spend more.
Yeah.
So I appreciate them taking care of, just painting Bunny Davis or fixing Jackson Park or just
Yeah.
little things that can make a big difference without spending a lot of money, to keep it
It,
going.
too, if
Right.
you look,
yeah.
So I appreciate that.
Yes.
I thought it was real exciting, Randy. I don't know what's wrong with you.
Okay, I guess I'm a weird, I don't. It's a good nap reading if you wanna.
Maybe next time you could do some sort of dance with it.
You know what I could do? I could put some
You and Lee
music.
could two-step.
Well, I hate to hear what he's gonna say about mine, so.
Oh, you know what? Tell me what your favorite song is, and I'll put it in the background while we're playing this. I could do that, or.
Do you see any of the, like, the retirement rates are going down this year? That's
Yeah,
great.
Yeah,
That's good. That's a lot of money when you look at that.
it is, especially on hazards.
But what do you see, what are you seeing for the future? Are they going to the league? Are they going?
go back up a little
Okay.
bit. I think next year on the retirement, I think you'll see a 1 or 2% increase, honestly.
I think, I look at the.
They've not said that, but the markets, when you look at the data from the big banks that we've been
Yeah.
monitoring that are out of the Cincinnati area that really have mirrored ours, that's going to be the trend probably. So I don't know that it'd be a full COLA, but you're going to see something above zero next year. That's going to be an increase, in
Yeah.
my opinion.
Which,
I think-
I'd like to see,
I'd
like
like to be
KLC to go up there and lobby again for that, because, to make sure it stays, or we can keep it low.
The last thing I read when I looked at the financials on the CRS fund, I think it was about 70% funded versus like the state retirement was about 20% funded. So I think if you can keep that funding, this is just me talking, it's that 70 to 80% range, I think the rates can stay down, because I know they have their own fiduciary board now, oversight committee, and if you can keep it there, I think the rates will stay favorable. The only thing is with more retirees going in out of tier 1, is that going to stress the fund, the retirement fund? So then that could drive those rates back up, like if people are aging out of the system. I don't know the answer to that, but we've been fortunate, but we can never bank on that always being there, right? So we got lucky we just get lucky the last couple of years. That's really what comes down
My
to.
instinct is it's going to go up.
Yeah.
Next year we're due, because it's gone down 2 years in a row. It's not going to keep that trend.
They were
Yeah.
watching it.
Yes.
So they had an
Yeah.
eye on it, so I just wonder what they're seeing.
I mean, 70% liability funded is pretty good compared, but it's not great, right? It's still not Thing is, I think they've tried to freeze those assets to where they can't be used for other things.
Yeah.
Okay. So we will dive into budget draft operations. So this is with a flat compensation. This is if you choose to do nothing at all to our compensation. So I want you guys to keep that in mind. And Randy mentioned that personnel is about a third of our overall budget. And when you take out your capital, comparatively, your personnel is probably 60 to 70% of your operating budget, which is why, like you guys mentioned sustainability, we've mentioned it. It has to be sustainable because that's your largest driver on your operations.
So, yeah, so the first step is to make sure that we have a balanced budget, right? Which is why I want to reiterate that. The numbers that she's got today have no employee cost to it, extra.
And I think for most, if not most departments, when they built out their budget, 90% of them did contain costs compared to last year. Most of them lowered them slightly. So they are very mindful, so I just wanted to kind of emphasize that. So, revenues, we'll start with general fund revenues. Total estimation for operating revenues for fiscal '25 are $21,745,959. So taxes and fees, we had discussed a couple of times earlier in the year, that's your property taxes. Earl has provided you a copy of current rates on that. This $2,365,000 number, that is an assumption using the compensating rate, which is historically what we've done over the last several years, which, if you remember, that is the rate that you select if you are trying to capture the same level of revenue as you did the prior year, with only new revenue coming from new assessments, essentially, new developments. So effectively, that means that your city of Danville tax rate decreases year over year.
Lee, do you
yes.
have what the total would be if we?
So
take the quarter? You may
I
get
didn't
into that
prepare
later.
that based on it had seemed in previous regular commission meetings that you all were not super interested in discussing an increase or a change from that. It would be about a $70,000 to $80,000 increase in revenue to the city, with probably the rates that we estimated would increase about from 0.1145 per $100 to 0.1196.
So the question in front of you is not necessarily whether or not to raise the rate. The rate is going down.
Yeah.
And so you're lowering the property tax rate unless you take action that is subject to recall to overturn that, right? So the question is, do you lower the rate, the minimum that, or I guess the maximum it's going to go to low-wise is 0.1145, and you can stop the decline at 0.1196, right? So 0.1196 generates about $70,000 to $80,000, I say $80,000 more revenue, because that projection doesn't necessarily account for the growth. So the growth's usually about $15,000 or so, plus or minus. And so ultimately, your impact on your property tax, if you only go down to the 0.1196, will be about $90,000 probably in real revenue, right? And so then your other option, if you go all the way down to 0.1145, you're going to generate about $2.38 million next year in property tax revenue.
Okay.
So that's really the question, is how low do you let it go down? And I know that, that's a tough call. Do you take the 4% net change in revenue, or do you let it go all the way to the compensating rate, which is essentially flat revenue for the city?
I'm just thinking about our discussion about sustainability going forward, and this is something we've hesitated to do, but, you know, sometimes things change, and it's something that sort of compounds on itself as well.
Absolutely
It does.
does, yeah,
It does.
So
yeah.
And like we
I'd be
said,
willing to put it back on the table myself, just for discussion.
I would too.
and the rate does, either option you choose, the rate goes down.
If you went with, if you went with the .1196, you could probably ensure that you could get that officer back. The first hire back by doing that. Without us getting into the expenses, we could probably get to a point where we could get that position back.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, this year, I'd also, like the other commissioners, .1196 is lower, and I would support that discussion, yes.
yeah. That's not always true per se, but in the year we're in, it's going down no matter what.
But, I mean, you gotta look at what's happening. I think we have to, as hard as it is, look at what's happening to, you know, everything's increasing.
Absolutely.
And we've gotta keep the staff, and we've gotta keep the city running, so I think that you gotta look at that.
So in our next iteration, we'll draft, the next time we come in, we'll draft, assuming that we're only going down to .1196, and we'll see what that looks like.
Thank you.
So license and fees, that's your occupational tax revenue, and those individual categories are on page 1 and 2 of your larger spreadsheet for revenue. But in total, that is $17,270,450. And if you look at page 1, the largest category of that is your license, your occupational license fee, which is your payroll withholdings. We have that currently estimated for the next budget year at $10,150,000. That's always your largest category.
We'll come back to that later on. I want to get all the way through it, and then we'll talk about that assumption. That's the one that I want more input on.
Penalties are minor. Service revenue, $346,000. That includes your transfers between funds to the general fund, your other recurring revenue, which includes, I apologize. Service revenue includes your contract, your contract with the county for 911 services. It includes fire protection. It includes some rental services. Your other recurring revenue is your transfers between funds, sales of property. That is totaled at $650,297. Your intergovernmental revenue, which includes 911 fees from the state. It includes your school officer revenue. It includes police incentive, fire incentive from the state. That is projected at $1.1 million for a total of $21,745,959 in a nutshell. And I'm going to keep going through these just because we do have a lot of numbers to get through. So when you guys have questions, please stop me. No,
Sorry.
absolutely.
On the revenue, the
Yes.
penalties.
Penalties.
What's in the penalties?
Well, it depends on which penalty you're actually talking about. So the penalties and forfeitures, those are like arrest fees and things
Okay,
like
yeah.
that from the state. The other penalty gets, as an individual line, gets lumped into tax, license and fees, and that is penalties for not paying for a business license prior to starting business. So if you start a business, you are required to have your license before you start. It's a $25 penalty if you do it after the fact.
I guess it wouldn't make a lot of difference in money probably. I'm just thinking code enforcement penalties and things like
Well,
that.
those-
Should we raise those because we're not, those are things that somebody's causing, those are.
Those absolutely probably have not been reviewed in a long
Right.
time for dollar thresholds. I can make that something that we look at in the upcoming year with
I don't
Tony.
know.
The problem with those liens, and just to be totally honest with you, it don't matter what we put on there.
Yeah.
The enforcement of those, the city's access, so if you have a house that is valued at $80,000 that we go have to file a lien against, we're filing a lien. If you double the cost of the lien, if it went from $800 to $1,600, if it goes into foreclosure, which we can't force at that number, it would take the bank forcing it at the $80,000 number. Once you go into foreclosure, then we're the last on the list to get the money back. The bank's going to get the $80,000 before we ever get that $1,600. So it really, the net impact of the city really doesn't help you to change the code enforcement fees per se.
I don't
The-
know, I'm just trying to think of a way you could,
I'm with you on that.
They're
I
causing
understand
the-
that.
right.
And
And
so
we're in-
Tony and I have not talked about that. So it's a good comment. My reaction is just, man, it's a frustrating thing to begin with because we see condemned property everywhere.
But I
So-
mean, we're bearing the cost as a
We
city.
absolutely
And if you
are.
look at all those costs that I know we had before those lists and houses, I mean, we're mowing over and over and over and over. There's no incentive for them to stop not
We
mowing their
did,
grass.
we did have a positive lien recovery month, last month, from what I remember. But I'll
Something to look at. I don't know.
see, we'll talk about that with Chief and try to figure something out. I don't know what you can do, but my fear is that it's just going to go into the oblivion because we have such a hard time. We're such a small piece of the ultimate lien holder list.
Well, I think, and the ones that we do continually do year after year after year, until legal action by somebody is taken, nothing's gonna happen. I think the impact you would see would be from the folks that you only interact with a handful of times. Like, we've cited you once or twice and then filed a lien and you remediated it. But it's always good to review your fees at least every few years, because frankly, it may or may not be worth the time of the employee to go out there if
Right.
it's depending on the type of issue.
Just something to think about.
We'll take time to do that through the spring.
Expenses for the general fund. So in total, this is just for operations, to keep the city, going as it is, $21,720,299. So I've got your individual department totals, because there's so many in the general fund on the slides. I didn't break it into personnel, et cetera, but that is included in your packet. The personnel, your contract services, and your other for each department has those totals. So your legislative, and just, to emphasize for the public, your legislative executive budget at 1.6 million total includes 1.184 million in personnel costs, which includes salaries, benefits, retirement, medical, all of that. So the other $500,000 is what they operate on throughout the year.
HR, for example.
HR, your engineering, city engineer, et cetera. Finance in total is set at $942,000, IT at $579,000, police is $5,781,000, fire at $4,448,000, communications or 911 is $1.455 million, code enforcement is $139,000, public services or public works is at $2.214 million. So your community agencies, we have added in plug numbers based on historically what we did last year, just so that we could get a bottom line number, so that we didn't try to balance without that, and then have to pull expenses out of departments later down the road. So those are community agencies, and then also within your non-departmental budget on page 13, those are highlighted in red. Those are just plugs based on either what was done last year, a good estimate of this year, or for instance, with planning and zoning, we agreed to the change to move the Architectural Heritage Board, so we included some additional costs for them to accommodate that. So those are plugged in, but the others are, the totals in black on those pages are what we estimate for next year. So your community agencies, we left flat at 155, 175. Your non-departmental, which includes transfers to other funds for support for operations, at 2.239 million, and your debt service, which is 2.107. So like I said, other than a few like known changes that we have, so for instance, not to pick on fire, in fire, they wanted to add cancer screenings for staff, which is critical in that type of role, right? So otherwise, other than known changes for cost, inflation, the operations side has been kept fairly flat.
Lee, excuse me, how are we this year as far against the budget as far as revenues go? Looks like we're a little short, but.
We are, Earl. We tweak it to as flat as we can get it. Earl we had a pause at it's about $25,000 difference and a budget quote-unquote shortage. Ideally, you make that up in not spending your full health insurance balance, because we budget to maximum health cost, just in case. There's a pretty good likelihood that some of your revenue numbers will be a little higher than your budget, because we do like to be conservative to a degree on that, so that we can ensure that we don't over budget expenses. Because at the end of the day, we do have to have the dollar in the bank to pay for it. But it is which this is still a draft, so there might be a few I can tweak further. But it's hard to define whose budget do you think is
Right.
overinflated when they're really, really minor.
Yeah, right.
So,
Thank you.
was there any specific general fund budgets you all want to look into?
And there's, excuse me for being ignorant, there's no capital,
There's no capital numbers in this budget
Okay.
whatsoever,
all right.
for
That's what I
no
thought.
fund or department. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And we will open the next meeting with, and we've not done
Yeah.
this, so to some of your questions about getting it beforehand, we've talked about, we want to present it to you and then give you a chance to digest it after that. We will open the next meeting and program into our schedule at the next meeting. Do you have any questions from your review of this over the last week? Right? That is the missing step that we've always, figured you all would bring it up, right? But we want to be more intentional about that. So we're going to ask you at the next meeting, you've looked at this, do you have any questions? Okay? And we won't, normally we don't do that, but we're going to do that.
Okay. So I will move right on. So next, I've kind of grouped municipal aid, police safety, drug forfeiture. They are minor funds. Well, municipal aid's not minor, but it doesn't have much activity in the next year other than its normal operations. So we've compared revenues to expenses. Josh has a slight spend down on his fund balance plan for municipal aid. We're projecting revenues, which is your state road aid, of $337,500. And I just misspoke a few minutes ago. Josh went ahead and included some capital on his total in that $475,000 that I did not get pulled out. But in total for that budget, $475,000, 275 of that is just normal paving and operations. I think he gave you guys an update about strategy on paving, on adjusting, because the cost has increased so much. So I know he's been mindful of that. Police safety and the drug forfeiture funds are very minor. The scale of those is off on the charts, but those are fairly flat. Police safety is your highway safety grant that we get from the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. That's a pretty even fund, so what goes out comes back in through grant funds. And then your drug forfeiture, we're projecting pretty flat at 5,000 in revenue, 5,050, I misspoke, and 5,000 in expenditures. And those are covered on pages 14, 15, and 16 of your spreadsheet packet. I didn't include a slide for your streetscape. I did include it because since it's still an active fund, we are not projecting any work to be performed in your streetscape fund. It will get some minor interest because that's how we allocate our interest throughout the year. So Park and Recreation. So that begins on page 18 of your packet. So your revenues are, your two biggest primary drivers are your governmental revenues from the city's general fund and from the Boyle County Fiscal Court. We are projecting a transfer from the city's general fund of $778,000. The contract with the county provides for $379,000 after the COLA adjustment for the year. We are projecting rentals of just various buildings, shelters, pool, et cetera, $50,000. The rental agreement at Jenny Rogers, we've separated out plus some potential rental of additional spaces in Jenny Rogers at $30,000. Program revenue, $152,000. Service fees of $30,000. Concessions at $105,000. Sponsorships and sales of $35,000. Some minor interest, miscellaneous items. So for a total budgeted revenue of $1,562,803. So I do know Tommy's got some changes coming to concessions he's planned for, selling some additional things that we don't do now. I think he bought a grill or a couple grills. And then they're going to expand their offerings. They are planning to, and I think they've already started a little bit allowing use of some of the classrooms at Jenny Rogers that are on our side for rentals of classes by certain groups and things like that. So they're expecting some really good usage out there.
Is he looking at the rental fees? I'm just looking at all.
So
forms,
as far as
rental
I'm
fees.
aware, we haven't discussed the actual fee yet. But I will make a note.
And like the Brown building or the building at Millennium.
We're looking at
things-
wholesale improvement to revenue generated from our parks. From our weekend tournaments to how we structure all of those things.
And we have seen a good improvement already in what, at least anecdotally from what he's bringing in tournament and over the weekend, fees like that. So I think they've already made some good strides, just from what I'm seeing coming through to the bank every day.
And I mean, it's great, like people rent Bunny Davis for birthdays and things like that, but it's really a minimal charge.
It is very
Compared
minimal.
to anything else in the world. Just saying.
It is very minimal. So your operating expenses for the park. So again, because there are so many different departments within the park system, we didn't break out personnel, but it is within the individual packets. So Millennium Park is budgeted at $811,000, the fitness center at $437,000, the pool at $86,000, community parks, which is your other various parks throughout the system, $37,000. Jenny Rogers, we've broken that out to its own individual department going forward, is $174,000. And then debt service, which is your fleet vehicles for the park system, at $15,000. So the Jenny Rogers is the big addition. Previously, kind of small operation charges have been lumped into community parks. But because there will be staff there, there's a building that they will need electric for, water for, et cetera. We wanted to break that out as its individual cost center, and that is included this year. They did not include the potential staff change of the full-time change of a maintenance to a rec coordinator at Jenny Rogers, because it's not set by you all yet, right? So they've estimated some part-time salaries to help cover activity there. But all just, other normal cleaning, telephone service, et cetera, within that budget.
Is the fleet service, fleet vehicles, the leasing of those, is that still is that the best way to go?
It's expensive. There's no question it's gone up. The price of new vehicles is unbelievable
Right.
now. So I would say right now, it is a win for us. We've looked at it, I've looked at it, not necessarily in minutia, but I've looked at it at a level enough to where I know that it's probably the best rate of return right now still. That is going to be a problem in the long term.
Yeah.
And it's not the lease rate, it is fleet.
Vehicle.
It is getting people to different locations is a increasing cost of all communities, but it's a problem for us. And so that is something we fully intend to continue to look at. I don't know what else to say about that. Right now, it's still probably the cheapest option by a good amount, especially when you consider flipping the fleet in any type of cycle that works.
Yeah.
Is that fair, Chief? Don't you agree on the cruisers too, and your issues? I mean, his department's the most affected by that ideology, and I would argue that it's benefiting. The only real thing that we've done that is, and we wanted to try it, which was we do have one vehicle that we are testing and trialing. It's the Mustang, and so we're seeing what that looks like long term. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, like you said, it is. It's not cheap, but it's also extremely expensive to buy vehicles. And,
Right.
Let's think it, like you said, something to look at.
Yeah.
To keep our,
yeah.
We all agree. Every department head, I had a conversation with a subordinate department head yesterday in the hall that was like, man, no one knows what to do, honestly. Like vehicles are extremely high.
So we do look at like lease terms, because we can adjust those at the individual vehicle level if necessary, right? What's bad, like the fleet, the lease term for Chief Gray's department the need is different than the lease term for the utilities department because of the manner they use their vehicles in. Frankly, I don't know enough about cars considering how many we lease. But I think that's a struggle that a lot of cities and a lot of entities are having, is how do we best cost effectively provide the vehicles that we need. This currently, I think, is it, but we do look at it regularly, so.
I had a request for a break.
Oh,
And I agree with
absolutely.
that request, so.
Absolutely.
We're gonna take a break?
Let's take a
Is
break.
that all we do? Okay.
Sounds good.
Miss Compton?
Okay, so before we move on from Park and Recreation, did you all have any questions about their expense budgets?
Again, I would just like the county, I mean, maybe we have that conversation, somebody is having that conversation with the county, you know, about fees.
Yes. So we will definitely look at what, especially considering we have done a lot of improvements to a lot of the facilities in recent months, what is considered appropriate for what we have. But I will touch base with Tommy and Josh on that. Yes, so cemetery funds. That begins on page 23 of your spreadsheet packets. So, your revenues in the cemetery fund are primarily derived, the largest category of support comes from your operating transfer from the general funds, at $270,000 for the upcoming year. Cemetery lot sales, we're estimating at $70,000. Services, which includes your cemetery job work, which is opening graves, burials, things of that nature, at $55,000, and some minor interest. Josh has discussed having a meeting with the cemetery board to discuss those fees that we do charge for burials and things like that, just to assess whether those are still appropriate in 2024, 2025, since they have not been assessed in a very, very long time. Total revenues are projected at $396,226. Expenses on your cemetery fund include personnel at $183,000, contract services, which includes a mowing contract, which is the biggest item, at $182,000. Just some other miscellaneous costs associated with maintaining the cemeteries at $17,000. Debt service, which is again for the cemetery fund, your fleet vehicles to maintain personnel throughout the to do the work of maintaining the cemeteries at $12,000. So for a total of $396,226,000. This is one of those funds that we really, operations, we try to either maintain at or under budgeted revenue. It's a kind of a net for us if it's operating as desired.
That's a good point. What, is that, do we have two people assigned there that under
To the
salary?
cemetery, yeah. 2 full-time.
I was just showing him, I mean, if you look at the, you know, the cost of the people and all this, or no, maybe that's not the personnel. But anyway, and then this is like one I would look at, your fleet costs are expensive, it looks like.
So I think for the 12,000, that's probably, based on those numbers, is probably 2 vehicles, would be my guess. I would have to pull the actual fleet invoices out to double check that. Especially in the last, we did see a jump overall in everybody's fleet this year because we had a large number of fleet leases, essentially, end, and some of the older vehicles that we have been waiting to get new vehicles on, we had a lot of rollovers. So they could be on the newer side, but the fleet lease is probably for 2, if I knew that off the top of my head. And that's probably I would say not 48, probably we do 48 for some vehicles, a 60-month lease, possibly,
Those should be 60s.
yeah. But like I said, without the actual fleet invoice.
I was just looking on your
Yeah.
spreadsheet, and it's just sort of
Yeah.
like your expenses, it's 17,000,
Yeah.
17,600, and then you look down at fleet, and it's 12. That's all, that's, you know,
Compared to others within that department, it is a little high. So we can look and have the cemetery folks evaluate if they can make do with less vehicles, or if they can extend their lease out when it's over. We do that a lot. Once we've paid the lease down, we keep the vehicle, and we just have maintenance charges on it and a small minimal, I think it's $20 to $50 fee to keep the vehicle after we've paid the lease down. So sometimes we pay them down a little quicker, depending on the vehicles and what type they are. Okay. Stormwater fund. So the stormwater fund, Josh has proposed, he will be proposing a increase to the stormwater fee. It has not been increased since its inception several years back into early 2000s. It currently is at $3.36. He is, with this revenue of $710,000, this includes a projected increase to $3.78. So a total of about 42-cent increase. So total revenues for service fees, $710, with a projected interest of $5,000. Personnel costs are estimated at $655,000. Contract services at $49,500. Other at $7,150. So debt service within the stormwater fund is a mix of, it does have some fleet vehicles at $4,000. And then you have a debt service payment for some infrastructure that occurred several years back of $48,000. And the large increase in personnel compared to last year does include the open position Josh has had for a while of your engineering tech stormwater coordinator. It also, the rate, which does come closer to covering your cost in total, is also with the thought in mind of some future infrastructure improvements down the road.
I did the math, it's like $5 a year or something
Yeah,
difference.
yeah.
It's not a huge amount, so.
It's not. I think he did that with in mind some capital improvements that he is going to be proposing down the road. And that addition should help cover debt service that will be included with it. But frankly, it's never been addressed in a long while. And that's something that we'll be looking at more routinely going forward, whether the fee is appropriate or not, so.
We've not done, that's one of the things that Josh and I've talked about. And he mentioned that one other time to you all. We've not done the COLA with it like it should have been done. And so when the utility rates change annually in July, because of inflation, the 3% this year, we should also do that to the stormwater rate. It just makes us not less effective if we don't.
And I think the rate change is built into the utility ordinance, whereas it's not in the stormwater.
You're right.
So it just hasn't been kind of updated like that.
When did we start the stormwater utility?
2007-ish, something like that. I can't remember the exact year off the top of my head. I asked myself that whenever she said that. I want to say it was 2005 to 7,
Yeah,
somewhere in that range, yeah. And we,
If we'd added the COLA,
Unfortunately, Josh organized that first 20-year cycle of projects and then left us. And so then there was a several-year period where we were struggling to get staff in Public Works, not the existing staff that's there now, but some of the folks that we had cycled through to pick that up and carry it forward.
So it's
And-
Josh's fault. I say we
And so
take
I'm
that
blaming
against
Josh.
salary.
And so now that he's back, he's literally picked up right where he left off and updated it, and now he's going forward, so.
So your garbage fund, which is on page 27 of your packet, we are estimating total revenue at 1.49 million, which is a transfer from the general fund of 50,000, fees from garbage collection bills on water bills of 1.4 million, and then some minor interest. The solid waste contract, which is the garbage service, is projected at 1.49. And then we have a recycling contract of 45,000. There is a net negative on revenues versus expenditures, especially with rental markets where folks are, a property might be empty for several weeks or several months, and Republic is still swinging by to pick up that garbage can, but we're not collecting any money for it. So there's unfortunately, there's always a little bit of a deficit on that impact. Over the last year and several years, they've done a lot of work on reviewing who is getting charged, what they're getting charged, and ensuring that the appropriate folks are being charged garbage services. And Josh is trying to narrow that gap as much as possible.
Yeah, say it like this, I've been debating on how to phrase this, but you do have a loss because you have vacancies and things. There's the turnover loss that occurs in the system, kind of cooked in. The Republic has a right to bill for the can, whether or not the home's occupied or not, for that 1 month, and then it catches up. And so we do end up losing money there, and the question will be ultimately, how do you deal with that? And do we add to the base rate above the direct cost enough to zero that out for vacancies to cover that loss of absenteeism, set like that? That's a big piece of it. That's a big piece of that number that's cooked into that. And so, anticipate that conversation coming forward. In the future, the next time the contract renews, we do have a couple of things we can do differently. One may be just to allow Republic to do the direct billing themselves and pulling the cost off of our water bill. That would zero that number out. But we'll go through that. That's not possible till the contract renews, which is, I want to say, is 25 maybe. Or,
I think this is the last year, and
Yeah.
we'll have to renew it for fiscal 25, 26.
so we're working on that, trying to develop an approach. Just want to make sure that's understood.
The transfer from the general fund, is that the $50,000, what is that?
I mean, primarily, it's to help cover the contract for recycling with Boyle County, but it catches a little bit of the overage to kind of reduce it a little bit, so that your fund doesn't just continually,
In fund accounting, it creates a
yeah.
liability there.
Yeah.
There's that, but, we're trying to manage that liability to make that as small as possible.
so, I mean, you could not do it, but then your fund would just keep sinking further down.
Yeah. And you could pass that recycling contract directly into your rate and recover that, but I don't think that's necessarily the right thing to do either.
And the
On that.
contract with the county for recycling, it's a 10-year contract. I don't exactly know when it renews, but we've got a solid 3 or 4, possibly 5 years left on it.
Yeah, that was legitimately confused a few years ago when we were going through some turnover within the city. The state designates the solid waste coordinator to be housed at the county. the solid waste coordinator supports the city staff in a lot of ways, and we appreciate what she does, and always has done. We worked really closely, myself with Donna, and I want Josh to work with their staff now. But, so that is a valid city reimbursement to the county, and we certainly endorse that, and we, Angie does good work to support Public Works or support us when we have a question. She deals with the Alum Spring landfill, the collection center at Ghost Pike. Those things are a service to the citizens also on certain levels, and so we appreciate that support by the county and Angie.
And that actually, I just pulled it up. It was set in 2020, in fiscal year '22, so it will be renewed in 2032, so. The utility fund starts on page 28 of your packet and goes through your, through page 37. Revenues, so within the revenues, we have not included anything that will be related to any capital items. So for the current year, projected current year, you have a total of $11,855,621 in operating revenue. That includes your water service, sewer service, any surcharges, tap fees, labor, turn-on fees, et cetera. And then you have some non-operating revenue that occurs just as a routine part of doing business, including interest. We have a tower rentals of our water towers for communication equipment, and some miscellaneous items for net of $204,622. So total revenues are $12,060,242,000. So this is with a estimated COLA for the upcoming year of 3.4%, which would be added on to water services as the ordinance says. So that rate change usually occurs somewhere between September and October-ish on that end. So expenses on the water fund include your utility administration department, your water treatment plant, water distribution, wastewater treatment plant, sewer collection and rehab, your Paravel sewer plants, some non-departmental charges, and debt service. All total, that is $12 million, $12,402,000, $12,402,201, page 37.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So included in the department's individual lines broken out is your personnel, contract services, other. You do see some big numbers in some of the departments that are not personnel related. Electric service in the water plant is a lot. It takes a lot of electricity to run that for the year. Chemical costs are one that we know will be high. Things like that impact your budget.
So the debt profile for the utility is the one that we've always, we try to manage again. So, we know that there's a next phase of the wastewater plant coming online. What we like to do is align new debt with as debt's retiring, trying to keep this number flat as you can over the course of time. so that users, as you come and go from the system, pay for the infrastructure as they come and go from the system. So there is, in the utility industry, it is the use of debt to ensure that the ratepayer pays as you go is one of the tools you actually use to do that. But nobody likes debt, but you do carry a lot of debt on the utility side. I want to talk about that as an item, just so that you are aware that we know that too, we see that. The good news on the utility side too is most of the things that Marshall has in the books right now are funded if they come in an appropriate budget number consistent with what the engineer's estimates are. You have a lot of ARPA expenditures. I know he had an RFQ or RFP went out yesterday for the Junction City and Perryville improvements that are ARPA funded totally. And so you're going to have about a 14-month period right now that we're in where Marshall's kind of busy. He's full. We can't really take on new projects anyway. He's got to deal with the ARPA, getting the ARPA obligated and spent. Spears Creek Pump Station's one of those. Like I said, the Junction City and there's collection system improvements in Junction City. There's the wastewater plant in Perryville. There's sewer collection system improvements in Perryville. And then, of course, we got to finish up the water line to Springfield. That's already funded. So now that's kind of where we're sitting. There is the chance that, for example, McKinney, if you'll remember a few years ago, McKinney signed a request to purchase water. There's a chance that comes out. That would require new debt, but that's tied to a new revenue stream, right? And so we'll just kind of continue to work our way through management of the utility over time, but understand that we're aware of those things. The biggest problem here is turnover of labor and retirement, and that is a major problem for the industry as a whole. And then just controlling the cost tied to the inflation, the chemicals, the vehicles, those things. And so this has a higher percentage of equipment and cost than any other operation the city does. Equipment and baseline operating expenses. So this does not look like the general fund when you break it out.
How long does it take to train different levels in the water?
So the easy one to point to is the water plant. So if you come in at the water plant, unless you have a college degree in biology or environmental science, you're going to come in as a water plant, as a water operator trainee. It's going to take you a year to get your first license. And then each year after that, you can update your license. You have to get to a level 4, so it takes about 5 years before you can operate at our water plant by yourself.
Wow, okay.
Right. So on the surface, the police, for example, folks look at the police and we acknowledge it takes, 10, 12 months sometimes to get a police officer from hiring into a car on their own. That's 5 years for a water plant class 4 operator, right? The fortunate thing is you just don't have as many of those. You only have about 10 plus or minus any given time. And so it's a more manageable quantity of license, but at the same time, that is a very risky department. Same thing for the wastewater plant. It's class 3 plant, but will be ultimately class 4. You have to get to a class 3 license. The wastewater plant's a harder license to get. The tests are much harder. And you got water distribution, the same thing. You got class 4 license in water distribution and sewer collection. So that is something that Marshall is keenly aware of, and we can spend a lot of time talking about. But that is part of that 5-year plan. We do need to make, put it on paper and make us. We do it ourselves individually and as department heads, but we need to put it pen to paper and make that a chart and really get into it at that level. That makes good sense for this department as well.
Thank you.
The Kentucky River Authority fee. We still have to pay.
We have to
We
pay
have to
that.
pay
That is the cost to administer the Kentucky River Authority. our lake, the Dix River Lake,
Which we don't-
isn't directly tied to that, but our water does discharge into the Kentucky River. So we pay a discharge fee, we don't pay a maintenance fee. So there's two tiers to that fee because we sued in an effort back in the 80s and 90s to not pay that fee. We lost, and so we do have to pay the administrative side of that because the water that goes out through the Dix Dam does end up in the Kentucky River. So we do pay that. That is a pass-through. That is just like a sales tax. It's just a straight tax or fee.
But it goes to the customer.
Goes direct bill to the customer for water consumption, and it's passed straight on the Kentucky River Authority.
So like in 22, it was 83,000, or it looks like on the annual, and then this year, looks like a projected 69,000, or, you know,
Yes,
roughly.
yeah. So that's their, essentially what they tell us.
Oh, okay.
What
Right,
that
you
we,
didn't know.
yeah, they say this is what you're gonna pay, and we don't really have much of a option
Right.
on that.
They invoice us that based on
Yes.
our Division of Water reporting.
Okay,
Our water consumption, they invoice us based on the water consumption
so it
quarterly.
changes.
Yep.
And will you go up in rates? Like, I guess 12 million for income and 12.4 for expenses? We're losing,
So part of that is, and
Three-quarter.
Marshall and I barely hit that this morning.
Yeah.
When he formulated his department budgets, he did not have in there, I didn't get it in there for him, his interfund charge, which is the cost essentially for my time, Earl's time, anybody that is not in the utility funds, time and salaries essentially to work on water-related things, right? A significant portion of my time deals with money for the water department.
Wow.
So we missed the interfund charge, and then also every fund in the non-departmental, it's that non-departmental section that throws us off sometimes. There's a contingency fund in the general funds and the utility fund, a contingency budget total. It's not an actual fund anymore, for things that may occur that we don't anticipate, like a major, if all of the windows at the front of City Hall are broken out by something, right? We don't plan to replace those each year, but we create a contingency. So that's what that is. Marshall and I discussed it a little bit this morning, so we'll have to reassess
Okay.
whether some of the revenue numbers are a little low, or if some of the expenses can be brought down a little bit and managed that way. So right now, there is I think it's about $300,000 that we'll need to adjust within there, which sounds like a lot, but
Yeah.
within 12 million, it's feasible.
okay.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
So he's got some work to do. He knows that on expenses. Part of it, though, we waited because once she added those numbers in, we waited until we hear on the personnel cost so that he gets into what his actual need is. And then he'll dive into that.
Okay, thank you.
So we will hit museum fund next. This is one of those other small funds that we like to, that's just the cost to maintain the building. Revenues consist of the transfer from the general fund and some interest. Expenses consist of contract services for things like HVAC maintenance, like things like that, and then a minor debt service payment, which is related to the energy efficiency debt service from several years back, where we improved the energy efficiency of all of all buildings that the city had at the time. So we try to net that fund to break even. So projected for the year, $56,038 in revenue and $56,038 in expenses. So other than general maintenance, nothing additional is planned for this fund for the upcoming year.
And is this just the federal building, or is it also the
this
new
is-
building?
So this is just the federal building. Other than, I think there might be, insurance on the new building, but the new building, the lease agreement required that all of that maintenance be done by the leaseor. There are certain things that we are responsible for as the building owner, but they were also responsible for the upfit with the renovations, so.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Ooh, parking fund. Okay, so parking fund, your revenues, total for the year are projected at $433,722. That includes a transfer from the general fund of $132,000, some parking fines of $8,500, parking fees for the lots of $11,000, parking fees from the garage, of $275,000, and some minor interest and miscellaneous items. Personnel for the year totals $68,000. Contract services, $86,000. Your other at about $7,300, and then debt service on the garage at $271,000. We did increase in the current fiscal year, which impacts next fiscal year, rates of some of the leases at the parking garage due to the lease schedules and how they are documented and what the agreements are over the last, that's included in those lease schedules. At some point in the future, we may address the lot fees. Those have not been updated or changed in many years. But that kind of comes with a wider discussion of parking strategies for downtown areas.
Yeah, we're not done talking about parking. Tony, Chief and I have got to sit down and go through some things with Josh and try to follow up on the conversations that have been on hold now for 8 weeks. And so we got to circle back to those, and we will do that before the budget process concludes.
Does anybody know off the top of their head when the parking garage is done being paid for?
Oh, it's probably
2037, I think.
2030.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
Not close.
Yeah.
Okay.
What about the energy efficiency? A long time.
That one's probably 2040, I want to say. Yeah.
2017.
I think.
I think that's your 2017 bond, which would be 20, energy efficiency. Yeah, energy efficiency is actually 2037.
Yeah.
And that is spread throughout your general fund, museum fund, parking fund, and your utility fund. So that was a lot of numbers over a lot of different areas. Is there any that you all want to go back to revisit, or questions about more questions about parking? Because we wanted to have a brief discussion on community agencies as well.
I mean, obviously, I think we need to look at the fees again, or what the overall thought is for parking. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that one's a good one to talk about, just because, like, for instance, the rental, the lot fees, the rate that we rent those at has not ever changed, as far as I'm aware.
Most communities try to set you break your parking fund out because you're doing specific parking enforcement usually. Most people try to make that break even. We have never done that here, ever. We originally started by just having the police department do it. Time passed, and you had a police officer migrate into the role with part-time support, and that was Tom Broach, with some part-time firefighters, or just whoever doing the beat. And we migrated into a full-time parking officer over time, and at one point, I think we even had two, maybe one full-time, one part-time. But most people try to make that zero out so that there's no general fund contribution to parking enforcement. I don't know if we can get there or not, but that's one of the tenets that I want to get into the conversation with. Also, just parking utilization is low for us, believe it or not. Josh has done a good job of doing actual parking stall counts and done some spot verification of utilization. It's not as high as it should be at all, even though the perception is that it's full, that we don't have any parking anywhere. That's just not accurate, but at the same time, maybe we've got to move some of the parking around so that you have access to parking in different locations, and that would decrease that pressure. So we acknowledge that the parking has always been a problem, and it's not solved yet, but we want to just try to make it more efficient through our budget process this year, and try to make it easier on the staff to enforce, and make it a better service for the businesses that are directly impacted, particularly by the 2 hour. Let me take over here real quick before we get into this slide at length. So the process that we did was, before we wanted to get these spreadsheets produced and ensure that the city could operate, right? So we've gotten to the point where we can maintain all of our staff as they're sitting and pay the expenses as we're sitting, with a caveat that Marshall's got to do a little bit of work to tidy up his budget. So this represents a balanced budget for no extra expenses. Now, one of the things we did in this budget is make a baseline assumption of the community agencies, the economic development. We put, and you'll notice this on some. Can you look up
Page 13.
Page 13. I didn't.
Oh, I'm sorry, page 12.
Page 12. So 12, you'll start to see the non-departmental expenses and some of our assumptions. The working assumption is that we reserved $155,000 to be distributed to the community agencies that we did last year. We did, for example, the same allocation, or increase the allocation based on their request, $100,000 for planning and zoning. We maintained the EDP, or EDC, I'm sorry, at $100,000, the EDA at $50,000. Those numbers are to be talked about. They're going to come and make their presentations to us, but understand we made those baseline assumptions in these budgets, okay? So in that 155 number for community agencies, the Senior Citizen Center had a big number in there. So when, in meeting with their director, he has a capital request that he's going to present to us and talk about. Well, maybe that's credible. So those increasing those dollars, we did not program in yet, okay? I want to make sure you all know that. So we were going to go through the community agency and hear everyone, and then to see really how that plays out, okay? We do think these are the pressures that are unresolved on this balanced budget. We do think the community agencies, and we have this unsheltered, homeless, insecurity issue that's going to request money. You are going to have to make some decisions on what to do about the homeless issue. Economic development, we want to see what those folks are asking for. We think they're asking for more than 100. Then the increased local agency request, which is your Senior Citizen Center, for example, as an easy example, not to pick on them or highlight them, but we do know that he has a good idea, as he presented to me yesterday, that he wants to share with the community. So we're going to have to navigate those things as increases and as pressure on the budget, okay? Now, the budget, saying that then, the budget that you have in front of you is a balanced budget with no personnel changes in it, none. Okay, so Randy's proposal, if we go back to his presentation without going back to it, if we'll remember, Randy and I recommended probably option 2 as being the most sustainable, affordable option, which was adding $585,000 in personnel expenses to this budget, okay? Now, how do we do that? If this is already balanced, how do we do that? Okay. this budget is provided with certain assumptions that Lee and I made. For example, no personnel changes. But also, one of the things I want to first bring our attention to is the very first page, and that is the, and in a specific line, the occupational license fees. Okay? Lee and I have projected that very conservatively over the last 3 or 4 years. We have, in reaction to the market, not knowing what would happen, we have underestimated that revenue line by a good amount over the last 3 or 4 years. For example, this year, if you look at the fourth column, annual budget 24, we estimated that, and we built our budget last year using $9.3 million as a projection. It looks like today, and it may not get to this number, but it looks like today that the number at the end of the year for that line item will be 10.7, okay? So Lee and I made a certain assumption as we were putting this balanced budget together, what we felt like was still very conservative, okay? Which was still a safe number, which was $10.1 million, okay? So now then, I want to make sure you all agree that is acceptable, or is that too conservative? I want you all to tell us, really, we have tried to be conservative with our expenditures and our revenues over the last 3 or 4 years as we recovered from COVID. And so we have intentionally not asked that question about our assumptions over the last few years because we felt obligated to make sure we were conservative, right? So, okay, so we've gotten past that, and so we're here. We need to pay for salaries, and so if you all want to, the simple way to do that is talk about our assumptions. If you want to critique our assumptions, feel free, but if you feel like that it is more transparent to estimate that at 10.7, then that covers Randy's option 2 fully, just by that one assumption. Right?
Not to interrupt, so the annual actual, looking at the same line, 2023 was 11.3 million.
Correct, right.
So what does concern me is that this year we've gone down to 10.7.
That's correct.
So,
So it was argued when we were dealing with some of the economic forecasts through KLC, it was argued all cities saw that increase in 2023. That was an influx of ARPA money into the payroll market, honestly, and some of the federal
okay.
stimulus. And
Okay.
so then we had a rate change over the last 5 years, 7 years that, and I forget the exact year, but that as salaries went up during COVID to maintain, because of all those federal benefits and things like that were entrained into the market, ARPA money, the salaries aren't going to go backwards necessarily. Our salaries aren't going backwards. But to what extent are they going to contract? So Lee and I didn't estimate 11.2, we estimated 9.3, and we're coming in at 10.7. So is 10.7 the right number to build our budget from, or is some number below that? So if you wanted to be probably neutrally conservative, you would just say, well, Earl, plug in that number 10.7, let's see what you can build a budget from that, plug in some recommendation on payroll. Okay, well, let's see what that looks like. But at the same time, you all could challenge us to say, Earl, we're not willing to go higher than a 10.3 estimate there. And then you're going to make me go back to Tony and say, Tony, can you find $100,000 or $50,000 out of your budget? Or Parks and Rec, or all the departments collectively will have to find that extra money to make sure. I don't know that we can do that. I'm not, but I do want to test mine and Lee's theory on our assumptions against your all's belief or opinion before we start talking to department heads.
What did you base the flat budget on?
The fiscal, Current year or last year?
This budget,
Projected?
what we have,
The 10-1, how do we get there? Is that the question?
so the flat budget you presented is
Yes.
based on coming in at 10-1.
Yes,
Okay,
yes, with no personnel changes,
with no personnel.
yes.
And I want to be
So-
clear about that. That's not rate dependent. That is purely what we are estimating the market to be. That is not, there is nothing, that is our assumption.
Right, it's not
I just
a
want to be clear
known.
about that.
It's
That's,
not a known,
that is
it's just-
totally a
And it,
projection.
and it is a conservative one because that's,
I feel that's what our job is.
You know?
Right.
Is
Yeah.
frankly, and if you all want us to be less conservative, I'm
Yeah.
asking you to
But
tell
I
us
think you
that.
have, I mean, in my opinion, you would have to go a little less conservative to see what the budget would, what you could do. Because your estimates may be way under.
oh, absolutely,
And
it
they're
could be.
probably gonna be the way it looks, you know, if right now we're almost at 9,
If you went to 10.9,
right,
that would be speculative.
right.
I would say 10.5 would be an increasing degree of conservative. I think a 10.7 number there is just really a baseline conservative number, no increase, no decrease. Does it make sense? I don't, absolutely would not encourage us to speculate on that number going up.
I think also historically, we budget the revenue numbers typically in late February, early March. And normally that annual as of is a February number, right? So you don't have that March occupational tax number, which is, and then you don't have the April one, which is the collection of the next quarter, right?
Yeah, you got a full
got a
quarter.
lot.
Yeah.
You got a full,
Quarter.
So those ending quarters, like Earl and I were just talking about, those last quarters are, sometimes they can be big ones, which is great. But it's hard to estimate from my perspective, because if I think it's too high and we budget too high, then there's, you know, you don't want to end up with no dollars in the bank to pay things that we've obligated ourselves for.
But you could watch the
So.
numbers, I mean, if we say go a little less conservative.
Oh,
And just
absolutely.
look, I mean, the budget's not been passed.
Absolutely.
And you can see if something's trending way down, then you could back up and say, wait, you know, something's
let me
wrong.
ask you all
I don't
this.
know.
Do you all agree with the recommendation on the surface with option 2 on the payroll change? Do you think that's a philosophical good approach? Which is your baseline COLA plus a year of experience, which is consistent with our experience-based pay. And if you want us to build the budget, build a draft, so this is draft 1. If you wanted us to build a draft iteration around that idea, we'll work on that, right? We'll program that into each department and see what that looks like expense-wise. Meanwhile, how would you feel about that number if we assumed a less conservative position and used a round number of like 10.5, and then I talked to the department heads with the mindset of where can we find that extra $200,000 or whatever that gap is, and get to that number and let's see what that looks like. How do you all feel about that approach?
I personally like it.
I like it,
I definitely like option 2
on the payroll.
on the payroll.
I don't feel good about estimating, honestly, to the public, I don't feel good about underestimating our revenue.
No, I think it has to be honest, transparent.
I feel like that's, but we verbalized that we were intentionally doing that. We knew we were doing that, and we talked about that with everybody. Right? But I think we're past COVID enough now where I don't think it's fair to do that necessarily right now anymore.
I just wish we knew what our new baseline was. Because we went 9.4, 9.4. You know?
11.2, I know.
What's the norm gonna be?
I think it's gonna be another year before you really rely on that number. I do. And I think you're gonna have to go into this budget and you're gonna have to pick a number and balance your budget against that number. And then you're just gonna have to play it out, and we're gonna have to manage expenses through the year as that number comes in. If it's trending high, then we know we can continue to be normal. But if it's trending lower, I think we've got to tighten up as department heads along the way. So I think whatever you pick this year, I think we as staff have to do a very proactive job of internal management of our department budgets, including all of them. Parks and Rec, all of them. until we get control of that number. As an administrator, I have one opinion. As a taxpayer, I have another opinion, and that is I think it's safe to estimate a little bit different number, but at the same time, I wouldn't want you to go all the way to 10.7 probably, in good faith. I think hamstringing Lee and I at 10.5 probably is the right thing. And I thought about that in the night. Do we go all the way to 10.7? I just don't, I feel like that's probably not the right decision. I feel like stopping it at some number between 10.1 and 10.7, understanding it's an estimate. Like you're not, there's no action you were doing other than addressing your core assumption in building the budget.
And you'll talk to the other two.
Yeah, yes. I had an opportunity to talk to the mayor yesterday. I know he wasn't going to be here, but we walked him through the whole thing. And he kind of, he accepted what the premise that we were saying, and he, you know, I'm not going to speak for him. Y'all are welcome to catch him and listen to what his opinion was. But I don't think his opinion strayed too far from what mine was. But, you know, I'm allowing you all to guide my opinion as I talk to you. And so mine's not necessarily my personal opinion. It's what I hear you all, the feedback I get along the way. Does that seem like it? So the next draft we bring to you, so we'll have two things happen. Next week, we'll ask you all if y'all have any questions on this baseline budget. We will then, the next draft, please expect the revenue to be changed, particularly in occupational license, to at least 10.5. Then expect our expenses to include the option 2 on the payroll. And then we will have to address the expenses at the management team meeting and see if we can't then balance it after that. And so the next budget then hopefully will be a balanced budget that includes those two things. And then next week, we'll hear the community agencies and see what this spreadsheet's starting to look like that's built based on these concerns or these priorities that we are hearing, these pressures, and then go from there.
What page was the community agencies again?
So I didn't break it out. It is on page 13, but just as a sum.
And we meet next week on that?
Next week will be the presentations. Ashley has got a spreadsheet of their current ask, their last year, what they received. What we provided the last 3 years, and then their current year ask.
Jenny,
You'll get that information.
So she's way ahead of me.
yeah. The on sheet 12, about halfway down, you see the line 1610 out to the side. That is the first number we've embedded in this budget of $155,000. That's about what we did last year. I think it was what we did last year.
It is.
And then down below that, you see how we are estimating in red, for example, some of the numbers for different allocations.
Okay. I do
Yeah.
know the economic development is asking for 250. And
Yeah.
they've
Yeah,
already asked
we
250
did not
elsewhere.
build, we didn't build any of the increases. Most of your community agencies are asking for more this year.
Yeah.
So just to present this, we didn't include that. I do know that last year, comparatively for them particularly, we had originally included 100,000, and we increased that to 150 to include the website development. So from their baseline, it's a large increase, which you all will have to navigate. So they're all, I won't speak for all, because I don't know what the airport or the EDA is requesting, but most of them are requesting additional funds of some kind for this year.
Are we gonna hear the airport and all the big, like, planning on Thursday
Yes,
too?
yes.
And the little ones?
Yes.
Wow, okay.
So that's your all-day meeting, right?
That's your long one.
Yes,
That's the hard
that's the
meeting.
long one.
With the big ones in the morning, I guess?
Right
to-
now, your schedule, it starts at 8:30, and your last presentation is at 3:45 that afternoon. And we do start with the shared, we do start with the shared agencies, and those run from about, I think it's 8:30 until 10:30, once the presentation is over.
Okay, and something Donna brought up at the last meeting, or Commissioner Peak, sorry, is hearing more from the EDC, the Economic Development Authority. I mean,
Yeah.
because they have done so much and they've raised so much, and the whole commission needs to hear about that.
Yeah.
Probably quarterly, because to turn around and ask for 250 and the rest of the commission hasn't heard updates.
Some of the things like that, and that's a great point.
That's a big gap.
It's like that for all, we've tried to be intentional about bringing the departments in front of the commission, you know, and doing those updates, and, you know, Codes was on there last month. We've frankly didn't get to some of those things that we wanted to do last year that we heard you all saying. And I know that the community agencies has been an issue forever, getting them to report back. But, you know, we're going to carry that forward this year. We're going to try to do that this year. Should have done it last year, but we had all this stuff go on, and so we'll get there.
I will
know-
say, sorry,
no.
I was just gonna say, part of our goal this year with community agencies is to include that clause in their funding agreement, is that they do have to come back. Based on the amount that they receive, we like, the big agencies for sure that receive a large amount of money, at least come back quarterly to each commission meeting, or quarterly, and report to you all what the money's being used on for. And then those smaller agencies, maybe 6 months into the budget, I don't know how often you all want to hear from them because their ask is minimal. But if you all want to give me feedback on that, we can certainly include that in the funding agreement that they have to sign.
I just think for the community, and us and the community, you know, to hear from the department heads quarterly or something, you know, to hear what's happening and how their budgets are going or whatever, just an update. We see stuff, but it's nice to hear from them what's going on, how they're maintaining or they're not, or, and then the agencies for sure, we give this money, but yet there's no, you know, and you hear that reporting even to the community to say, oh, well, we gave $300,000 to this agency, but we really haven't heard from them. And then they come back next year and say, hey, we want some more. So, you know, it's just a nice, I would like to see that done. So I think all of us would. And me, I'll add this while I'm thinking about it because I'll forget. I'd like to review our goals and objectives that we set last year and see where we are, if we've accomplished anything or nothing at all.
Yeah, I've pulled that out, the KLC stuff.
Right.
Yeah, we will have we'll overlay that in some way for you so
Yeah.
you can see it, yeah. Yeah, we were on the same page with that one.
Okay.
That's all we got today, right?
That's it for us. Unless you guys have any other questions or you want to talk about anything
It's a
else
lot, so.
specifically.
Feel free to call us, and otherwise, you know, digest it, and then if you have any questions, we'll take them next week.
You are not boring.
No.
Don't listen.
Randy is, but I'm not.
Okay, so do we move to adjourn? Are you folks done? Department heads? Everybody's done? Do we have to move to adjourn? Yes. Okay,
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
okay. Everybody vote. All in favor?